The wind in the North African desert carried more than sand, it carried the echoes of a world on fire. By late 1942, World War II was no longer a distant conflict, it was a storm swallowing continents. Europe was collapsing under the weight of Hitler's ambition, Britain was bleeding but unbroken, and the Soviet Union was fighting for survival. And in the middle of all this chaos, a new decision was taking shape in the minds of Allied leaders, one that would eventually shift the direction of the war. It began not in Europe, but in the sun-scorched expanse of North Africa. After the fall of France in 1940, the map of Europe had been torn apart and stitched back together under German control. France was split into two parts, one directly occupied by Germany, and the other known as Vichy France, a government that appeared independent but obeyed Hitler's wishes. Large territories in North Africa, including Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, came under this Vichy regime. Meanwhile, Italy controlled Libya, and it became the battleground where the German commander Erwin Rommel, famously called the Desert Fox, worked his tactical magic. His fast-moving tank divisions, strategic genius, and daring maneuvers pushed British forces deep into defensive positions. Rommel's ultimate goal was clear: reach Egypt, capture the Suez Canal, and then drive into the Middle East. If that happened, Britain would lose oil supplies and strategic access to Asia, an outcome that could destroy the Allied effort. At the same time, the Soviet Union was suffering devastating losses on the Eastern Front after Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin repeatedly demanded that the Western Allies, Britain and the United States, open a second front to divide German strength. But the Allies knew they were not ready. The United States had only recently joined the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and its troops lacked combat experience. A direct invasion of Europe in 1942 sounded heroic, but military planners understood it would be a disaster. This was the world in which the idea of Operation Torch was born. Instead of charging straight into Nazi-held France, Allied leaders decided they needed an easier, safer entry point, a place where American soldiers could gain experience, British forces could apply their desert knowledge, and German power could be weakened indirectly. North Africa was the perfect choice. It was not as heavily defended as mainland Europe, yet it was strategically priceless. Whoever controlled North Africa controlled access to the Mediterranean Sea, could threaten Italy from below, and could eventually push into southern Europe. Meetings between U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill took place in late 1941 and early 1942. The British argued passionately that striking North Africa first was the only realistic plan. American generals initially disagreed. They wanted to invade France quickly, but gradually the logic became undeniable. A frontal assault on Europe without preparation would waste lives. A step-by-step build-up through North Africa could lead to long-term victory. This debate eventually resulted in the acceptance of a bold idea: launch a massive amphibious landing in Vichy-controlled North Africa. The operation was given the code name Torch. Planning began immediately, and it was massive. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a calm and steady strategist, was chosen as the commander of the operation. His job was not only to plan the landings but also to unify American, British, and naval forces, no easy task. The targets were selected carefully: Morocco and Algeria, both under Vichy control yet far from German troops. 3 major landing points were chosen: Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. Together, these areas covered hundreds of miles of coastline and required dozens of ships, thousands of soldiers, and flawless coordination. There was one huge uncertainty: how would the Vichy French react? They were not technically enemies, but they were not allies either. Some officers disliked Germany and quietly supported the Allied cause, while others remained loyal to the Vichy government. This confusion made torch risky. If the French resisted heavily, the landings could turn into chaos. If they surrendered or switched sides, the Allies would gain a quick victory. No one knew what would happen until the moment soldiers stepped onto the beaches. Meanwhile, German intelligence was unaware of the exact Allied plan, but Hitler suspected activity in the Mediterranean. He believed the invasion might hit Norway or the Balkans. This confusion was an advantage for the Allies. Still, they knew they had to move fast. If the Germans guessed the landing zones and reinforced North Africa through Tunisia, the entire operation could collapse. American soldiers preparing for the mission felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. Most had never seen combat. They trained on the shores of the United States and Britain, imagining the moment they would step onto a foreign battlefield for the first time. Many wrote letters to their families, unsure of what awaited them. British soldiers, more experienced in desert warfare, tried to prepare the Americans for the harsh sun, the shifting sands, and the cunning tactics of Rommel's forces. As the fleets gathered and the final plans were approved, Eisenhower emphasized three goals: strike fast, avoid unnecessary bloodshed with the French, and secure North Africa before Germany could react. Radio silence was ordered. Ships carrying tens of thousands of troops quietly crossed the Atlantic toward the African coast. The world remained unaware of the giant movement happening beneath the waves. Then came the dawn of 8 November 1942. As the first light touched the North African horizon, Allied ships emerged from the darkness like shadows materializing from the sea. Soldiers stood on decks, staring at the unfamiliar coastline. They knew the moment had arrived. Operation Torch, the first major American ground action against Axis forces, the first step toward liberating Europe, and the beginning of the end of Axis control in Africa was about to begin. The landings begin: Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers*. The night before the landings felt strangely calm, almost deceptive. Somewhere in the dark waters of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, thousands of Allied soldiers waited in silence, engines humming softly beneath them, unaware of how history would judge the next few hours. The order had been given. The ships had moved to their exact positions. And as midnight slipped into the early morning of November 8, 1942, the operation that had been whispered about behind closed doors for months finally came to life. Operation Torch was no longer a plan, it was unfolding in real time. Far out at sea, American and British destroyers cut through the black water, carrying the assault teams who would strike Casablanca on the western edge of North Africa. Casablanca was the largest of the landing points, and its capture was crucial. It wasn't just a port, it was a symbol of control over Morocco. If the Allies could secure it quickly, they would gain access to the Atlantic side of the region, allowing reinforcements and supplies to pour in. But it was also the landing with the highest risk. French forces stationed there were among the strongest in North Africa, with aircraft, coastal batteries, and naval power all capable of turning the invasion into a disaster. As the first faint glow of dawn began to touch the horizon, the soldiers inside the landing craft gripped their rifles tightly. For many Americans, this moment was their first taste of combat. The tension felt almost physical, as if the air itself had thickened. Officers checked their watches repeatedly, waiting for the signal to drop the ramps. The men had been warned that resistance was likely. What no one knew was just how unpredictable the French commanders would be when the first shots were fired. When the ramps finally splashed into the water, the assault teams sprinted out. Immediately, the silence shattered. French artillery woke like a sleeping giant, firing at the dark silhouettes of Allied ships offshore. The sky, moments earlier empty, became a battlefield of tracers and explosions. The water churned as shells struck dangerously close to the landing craft. But the Americans pushed forward, storming the beaches with determination. Their goal was clear: reach the coastal defenses before they could cause more damage. Meanwhile, the naval battle off Casablanca had escalated quickly. French warships attempted to break through the Allied blockade. American warships responded with heavy fire, and for hours the two sides exchanged blows. It was a strange sight: Allies fighting Frenchmen, neither side truly wanting the confrontation. But war rarely asks for one's preferences, it simply demands action. And so, both sides fought until the French naval officers finally realized the situation was unwinnable. One by one, their ships fell silent, some damaged, some sunk, and others forced to retreat into the harbor. While Casablanca erupted in chaos, another drama was unfolding hundreds of miles to the east. In Oran, Allied forces were preparing for their own landing, this one led primarily by American troops as well. The seas around Oran were rough, but the determination of the soldiers remained unshaken. The plan here was to capture the port quickly, as it was essential for bringing in future supplies. But Oran's defenders were well armed and unwilling to give up easily. The moment the American forces reached the shore, they were met with a storm of machine gun fire. French troops in defensive bunkers held strong positions, and the Americans had to fight inch by inch. One of the boldest moves of the entire operation happened here. Two British destroyers attempted to enter the harbor at full speed to disorient the French defenders and offload commandos directly onto the docks. It was a daring gamble, but bravery alone could not overcome fixed defensive guns. Both destroyers were hit heavily, one sinking before it could unload its troops. The other limped out of range, flames licking across its decks. Despite these setbacks, the Americans refused to slow down. They regrouped, brought in armored units, and began pushing deeper into Oran's defenses. For hours the fighting raged, trenches filling, buildings collapsing, and the streets of Oran echoing with the sound of rifle fire. Only after prolonged resistance did the French commanders agree to negotiate. They knew that further fighting would only destroy the city and serve no real purpose. By the end of the second day, Oran was in Allied hands. But the most politically sensitive landing of all was happening in Algiers. Unlike Casablanca and Oran, Algiers was not just a military objective, it was the political nerve center of Vichy-controlled Algeria. Here, Allied planners had hoped for a minimal fight. Secret negotiations had been underway for weeks, with certain French officers quietly agreeing to support the Allies once the landings began. These underground talks were risky, but if successful, they could save countless lives. And remarkably, the gamble worked. When Allied ships appeared off the coast of Algiers, many French officers hesitated. Some refused to fire at all. Others only offered symbolic resistance. A few units did fight, determined to follow their chain of command, but they were quickly surrounded by French officers who had already decided to switch sides. As a result, Algiers fell with far less bloodshed than the other landing points. The French leadership there surrendered within hours. This quick victory gave the Allies an immense advantage. They now had a major city, a working port, and most importantly, a political foothold. But behind the gunfire and negotiations, something deeper was happening. French officers who switched sides knew they were risking everything. If Germany found out, their families could be punished, their careers destroyed. Yet they chose to support the Allies because they believed the future of France depended on it. This shift of loyalty, though subtle, would prove to be one of the most decisive moments of Operation Torch. By nightfall on November 8, the situation across North Africa had changed dramatically. Casablanca was still fighting, Oran was bending, and Algiers had fallen. The Allies had not achieved perfection, mistakes were made, men were lost, and chaos erupted more than once, but they had accomplished the most difficult phase of the operation, getting ashore and securing footholds. But the real battle was only beginning. For now, the Allies faced a greater threat than French resistance, a threat already moving rapidly from the east. Germany had realized the seriousness of the situation, and Rommel's Afrika Korps was preparing to counterattack. What lay ahead would test every lesson the Allies had learned in these first brutal days of Operation Torch. Rommel strikes back, the race for Tunisia. The moment the news reached Berlin that Allied ships had landed in North Africa, the atmosphere inside Hitler's headquarters hardened like steel. The Mediterranean, which only days earlier had seemed secure, was suddenly a battlefield on the brink of collapse. For Hitler, this was not just another front, it was a dangerous crack in the Axis defense line, one that could widen and shatter everything Germany had built in the region. He responded instantly. Before the dust had even settled on the beaches of Casablanca and Oran, German transport planes were already roaring across the skies toward Tunisia, carrying soldiers, ammunition, engineers, and supplies. Their message was clear: North Africa would not be surrendered without a brutal fight. Tunisia, a narrow strip of land between Algeria and Libya, suddenly became the most important real estate in the war. Whoever controlled Tunisia controlled the gateway between eastern and western North Africa. If the Allies reached Tunisia first, they would trap Rommel's Afrika Korps between their forces and the British Eighth Army advancing from Egypt. But if Germany held Tunisia long enough, they could reinforce Rommel and turn North Africa into a deadly arena once again. The clock had started ticking. In the days after the landings, the Allied soldiers expected to face small pockets of resistance from the French. Instead, they found themselves racing against a far more organized enemy, newly arrived German and Italian troops who were already digging defensive lines around key positions like Tunis and Bizerta. The Allies had hoped for a quick drive across Algeria, but nothing in North Africa ever moved quickly. Roads were narrow and winding, choked with villages and rocky hills. Fuel trucks struggled to keep up. Tanks bogged down in mud from sudden winter rains. And worst of all, German aircraft began appearing in the skies, attacking convoys with terrifying accuracy. In Algiers, Eisenhower realized that Operation Torch had entered a second phase. The landings were complete, but the campaign was far from over. If the Allies wanted to prevent Germany from strengthening Tunisia, they needed to move faster than their equipment, faster than their supplies, and faster than the weather would allow. Commanders gathered maps across long tables, penciling routes, calculating distances, and estimating how many hours they had before the Germans turned Tunisia into an impenetrable fortress. At the same time, far to the east, Rommel's situation was deteriorating. The British Eighth Army under General Montgomery had just won a crucial victory at El Alamein, forcing Rommel's Afrika Korps into a long retreat across Libya. Rommel, exhausted but still sharp, understood that if he could reach Tunisia, he could link up with the reinforcements arriving from Europe and rebuild his forces. For him, Tunisia was not a hiding place, it was a lifeline. He drove his men through deserts littered with burning vehicles and the debris of their long campaign. Battles had drained his units, fuel was scarce, and the pressure from behind was relentless. Yet the Desert Fox remained confident. If he could reach Tunisia before the Allies closed in from the west, he might still hold North Africa. Meanwhile, the newly formed Allied units pushing east from Algeria faced their own struggles. Many American troops were frustrated but determined. They had landed with bravery at Oran and Casablanca, but those battles now felt like a warm-up compared to what lay ahead. They were marching into territory that neither they nor the British fully understood. The winter winds swept across the mountains, chilling even the toughest soldiers. Local roads turned to rivers of mud. Engines stalled. Supply depots lagged behind. The Germans, operating from airfields in northern Tunisia, struck without warning. Still, the Allies pushed forward. The first major test came in the thickening fog and rocky hills around the town of Jebel Abayad. American and British units advancing through the narrow passes suddenly encountered organized German resistance. It was here that the Allies first clashed with units from the 10th Panzer Division. Elite German troops hardened on the Russian front and now determined to hold Tunisia at any cost. The fighting was intense. German machine guns hidden behind boulders cut down advancing troops. Mortars burst overhead. American tanks found themselves ambushed from high ground, their crews rushing to return fire while shells ricocheted across the valley. The Allies were stunned by the precision and power of the German counterattacks. They had expected a race; instead, they had walked into a battlefield designed by experts. But despite heavy casualties, the Allies refused to fall back. Every mile gained brought them closer to Tunisia and closer to cutting Rommel off from the rest of the Axis. In Algiers, Eisenhower monitored every report, every radio message, every casualty list. He knew that if the Allies failed to take Tunisia quickly, the campaign would drag on for months. And every extra week meant more German reinforcements slipping across the Mediterranean. Eisenhower made a bold decision: unleash airborne forces to seize key airfields while ground troops fought through the mountains. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, landing in darkness and confusion, trying to secure positions before dawn. Some succeeded. Others were scattered by winds or caught by German patrols. The skies above Tunisia turned into a deadly arena, filled with dogfights as Allied and Axis planes wrestled for control. But even as the Allies fought desperately to reach Tunisia, Rommel was approaching from the opposite direction. His retreat across Libya had become a race against fate. Exhausted soldiers pushed through sandstorms, repairing vehicles as they moved, scavenging fuel from wrecked tanks, and digging defensive lines whenever they could. Rommel himself, binoculars in hand, directed traffic at choke points, personally guiding convoys through bottlenecks. He understood better than anyone, if he reached Tunisia and combined forces with the newly arrived German divisions, the Allies would face a nearly indestructible defensive wall. For a brief moment, the campaign hung in balance. The question was simple: who would reach Tunisia first, Rommel from the east or the Allies from the west? But the answer would not be decided by speed alone. Terrain, weather, air power, logistics, all four became invisible enemies shaping the course of the campaign. The rains fell harder. Roads collapsed. Food supplies thinned. Radios malfunctioned. Yet both sides pushed on, driven by the understanding that North Africa's fate would shape the next chapter of the entire war. By December 1942, Tunisia had become a battlefield waiting to explode. The Allies stood at the western gates, battered but advancing. The Germans were strengthening their positions every hour. And Rommel was closing in from the desert like a storm returning to its birthplace. The stage was set for one of the harshest and most unpredictable confrontations of the North African campaign. The fall of North Africa and the aftermath **. By early 1943, the sands of North Africa had transformed from a barren desert into a sprawling battlefield, scarred by the footprints of thousands of soldiers, burnt-out tanks, and shattered supply lines. The campaign that had begun as a daring landing at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers had evolved into a race across the mountains and deserts of Tunisia, a race that would decide the fate of the entire region. The Allies were no longer newcomers testing their strength. They had learned to fight in the harsh sun, to navigate treacherous passes, and to anticipate the desert fox's unpredictable tactics. Yet Germany and Italy were determined to hold their ground, pouring every resource into fortifying Tunisia as if the region itself were the hinge of history. The geography of Tunisia played a crucial role. Unlike the open deserts of Libya or the narrow coastal roads of Algeria, Tunisia offered a mix of rugged mountains, dense forests, and fortified towns. Every ridge, every village, became a potential choke point. The Allies advanced slowly but deliberately, aware that rushing would leave them vulnerable to German ambushes. Engineers worked feverishly to repair bridges and roads, while supply convoys struggled against enemy fire and the unforgiving terrain. The soldiers, seasoned by months of fighting, understood that victory here would require patience, coordination, and courage beyond ordinary measure. Rommel, despite earlier setbacks in Libya, had managed to regroup portions of his Afrika Korps. He directed his forces with a mix of brilliance and desperation. His strategy was clear: hold key positions, delay the Allied advance, and buy time for reinforcements to arrive from Europe. He established defensive lines around cities like Kasserine Pass, Sfax, and Sousse. Artillery emplacements, tank ambush points, and minefields were arranged meticulously, creating a labyrinth that would test even the most disciplined Allied units. The Germans knew they could not win through numbers alone. They relied on superior tactics, speed, and the sheer audacity of Rommel's leadership. The first major engagement came at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, a narrow gap in the mountains that offered one of the few direct routes for the Allies to advance. The battle was brutal. American troops, still gaining experience in large-scale operations, faced the full fury of German panzer divisions. Mortars rained down from the cliffs above, machine guns ripped through advancing infantry, and tanks rolled with frightening precision. Many units were pushed back, suffering significant casualties. It was a harsh awakening for the Americans, but it also taught them invaluable lessons about coordination, supply management, and the importance of combined arms strategy. British and French forces provided crucial support, stabilizing the front and preventing a complete collapse. Meanwhile, Allied air forces had learned to dominate the skies. Control of airfields allowed them to conduct reconnaissance, disrupt German supply lines, and provide close support to advancing ground troops. Bombing raids on railways, bridges, and ports in Tunisia began to cripple Axis logistics. Without steady supplies, Rommel's forces struggled to maintain their defensive positions. Trucks ran out of fuel, ammunition became scarce, and reinforcements arrived too late. The tide of the campaign, while slow, was beginning to turn in favor of the Allies. As winter turned to spring, the Allied armies coordinated a series of multi-pronged attacks designed to encircle Axis forces. From the west, American and British units advanced in concert, slowly tightening the noose. From the east, Montgomery's 8th Army pushed westward from Egypt, completing the encirclement. Rommel's forces, trapped between the converging Allied armies, fought fiercely to escape, but the network of Allied artillery, air strikes, and ground advances left little room for maneuver. By May 1943, the inevitable became reality: the remaining 250,000 Axis soldiers in Tunisia surrendered. The surrender marked the end of the North African campaign, and with it, a pivotal turning point in World War II. For the Allies, the victory had multiple implications. First, it removed the Axis presence from the African continent, securing the Mediterranean Sea for Allied naval operations. Second, it provided invaluable combat experience for American troops, many of whom had fought on European soil for the first time. Third, it opened the path for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, setting the stage for the eventual liberation of Italy and the southern front of Europe. Strategically, North Africa had become a launching pad for operations that would eventually reach the heart of the Axis war machine. Beyond the immediate military advantages, the campaign also had significant psychological and political impact. The success of Operation Torch demonstrated the potential of Anglo-American collaboration. It boosted morale among the Allied nations, proving that coordinated planning, careful execution, and bold initiative could overcome even the most formidable defenses. It also sent a clear message to neutral and Axis-aligned nations: the Allies were capable of launching large-scale operations far from their own territories and achieving decisive victories. For the Axis, the defeat was catastrophic. Germany had invested enormous resources, manpower, and strategic planning into North Africa, only to see it slip away. Italy's prestige, already fragile after defeats in Libya and East Africa, suffered further erosion. Rommel, once hailed as invincible in the desert, had been forced into a retreat that damaged both his reputation and the Axis strategic position. With North Africa lost, the Axis powers could no longer threaten the Middle East or Mediterranean oil supplies, and their forces were increasingly vulnerable to Allied offensives from multiple directions. The human cost of the campaign was staggering. Thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed, wounded, or captured. Civilians across North Africa endured the disruption of war, displacement from towns near battle zones, and the constant fear of aerial and artillery bombardment. Yet despite the hardships, the resilience of Allied forces and local populations ensured that the victories in North Africa were not fleeting. They represented a foundation upon which the next stages of the war could be built. By the time the dust settled, North Africa had been transformed. Ports, roads, and airfields captured during the campaign became critical logistical hubs for subsequent operations in Sicily and Italy. The lessons learned from amphibious landings to desert warfare, from combined arms coordination to multinational command shaped Allied strategy for the rest of the war. Operation Torch, once a risky gamble, had proven the value of preparation, intelligence, and audacity. It was a victory born not just from firepower, but from planning, adaptability, and the determination of soldiers who braved unknown shores and unforgiving deserts. As the sun set over the now quiet landscapes of Tunisia, Eisenhower and his commanders looked forward to the next stage of the war. The Mediterranean was finally under Allied control, and the Axis had been pushed back decisively. North Africa had fallen, not as a single battle, but as the culmination of months of planning, fighting, and strategic daring. It was a victory that would resonate far beyond the deserts, shaping the Allied approach to Europe, inspiring confidence, and proving that even the most formidable obstacles could be overcome with courage, coordination, and determination.